What's up, world, and welcome back to another edition of I Mix What I Like here at the Real News Network. I'm Jared Ball here in Baltimore. Today we're going to talk again with Brian Becker, who is the National Coordinator for the Answer Coalition and also an organizing member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. But today we're going to talk with him about his new book, Imperialism in the 21st Century, Updating Lenin's Theory a Century Later by the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Brian, welcome back to the Real News.
Thanks.
So let's start with that introductory broad question. Who was Lenin? Why does this book require, what is his theory of imperialism, and why does it require an update in the 21st century?
Well, Lenin was, of course, the leader of the Russian Revolution, the first socialist revolution, the first time where working and poor people not only seized power, but held power, and of course that changed the face of the 20th century. That revolution spread throughout Asia and Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. It inspired poor people to think that they too could organize and change society. Lenin was also an orthodox Marxist, but Marx died before what Lenin described as the era of imperialism. When Marx was alive, imperialism was a policy pursued by, say, the Dutch in Indonesia or the British in India or other places. What Lenin said about imperialism is that imperialism had evolved from a policy of the major capitalist countries to a global system whereby the entire world was divided between the small handful of imperialist countries into colonies, semi-colonies, and spheres of influence. And that global system had become toxic, it had become malignant because each of the capitalist economies had to continue to expand production, had surpluses, had surplus finance capital, but there was no place to export that capital because the entire world had been divided. And Lenin said, this will lead inevitably to war between the imperialists, and that was in essence his explanation of why World War I, a war without precedent in terms of the magnitude of carnage and violence, was taking place. So he wrote it in the context of World War I to explain that World War I wasn't an accident. It wasn't because the Archduke of Serbia got shot. It wasn't an incidental phenomenon, that it was an organic feature of modern monopoly capitalism.
And this was his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, right?
Right. So, in other words, capitalism had gone through a free market stage. It had evolved into monopoly capitalism. It was struggling to redivide the world because the entire world had, at that moment, been colonized.
Now, you talk in this book about the need to update his theory, that he was, I think it's fair to say, more or less, in your opinion, correct in his analysis of the day, but as Marxists need to do, as you also talk about in your book, Marxists don't just look to apply a strict theory of Marx or Marxism to any moment. They have to adjust it for the time and the conditions that they're dealing with. So what are the conditions now that Lenin's work at the time didn't account for or requires some updating?
Right. First of all, about Marxism as an ideology or as a philosophy, it's dialectical materialism, meaning it's unlike a religious dogma where it has a timelessness. The Bible says, thou shalt not, et cetera, et cetera. In the beginning, there was the word, timeless dogma. Marxism says that you derive theory based on the generalized experience of society or the class struggle, and that it must be based first and foremost on facts, and facts change. And Lenin says himself, theory is gray, but the tree of life is evergreen, meaning you have to constantly understand what's actually happening. So what's the big difference between Lenin's theory of imperialism and 100 years later when we wrote the book? Not the core assessment of imperialism, its malignancy, its desire for its drive to expansion, its domination by monopoly. That's all true, but what's different is that the world is no longer a colonized world. The world went from colonialism to neo-colonialism, and also where some of the colonies have emerged as major powers. And also what changed fundamentally after World War II was the Soviet Union was joined by other sister socialist republics in the People's Republic of China, Eastern and Central Europe, Vietnam, North Korea, later Cuba. In other words, 2/5 of the planet had become socialist and became the axis of a new kind of struggle, not between the imperialists who were fighting each other for colonies, there were no more colonies, but by the imperialist world as a whole, led by the anchoring imperialist country, the United States, the only country the only capitalist country that had survived World War II unscathed. All the rest were in smoldering ruins. But the United States rescued world capitalism and put all of the capitalist countries, including its defeated rivals, Germany and Japan, after a few minor punishments, directly in a united front with the United States as junior partners, not real competitors, as junior partners to fight the bigger foe, which at that time was the socialist governments, the socialist movements, the national liberation movements that were not only anti-colonial but socialist, because the victory of the socialist camp meant the absolute destruction of all of the capitalist countries. So there was a new axis of struggle. Instead of the imperialists fighting each other, they united under the umbrella of the United States leadership. That's what the UN was for. That's what the IMF was for. That was what the World Bank, that's what NATO was for. Uniting the capitalist, imperialist countries, divvying up parts of the world market, cooperating, but carrying out a ruthless struggle against those who wanted to build socialism or build national liberation movements associated with socialism.
So as you went to update Lenin's work, you, in your book, talk about a number of the things that he got right at the time, some of the things that, again, need to be adjusted for today. One of the elements of his analysis that you focus on is what he said about banks. And I do want to talk about the 2016 elections and how banking is being brought into that conversation and what some of the candidates are suggesting be done about it. But tell us what Lenin's argument was about banks and where they have increased power, or how his analysis played out, and where your book looks to take off from that work and update it.
Lenin said the briefest possible definition of imperialism as a global system, not as a policy, was to say it is a system of advanced monopoly capitalism, with the banks at the very center of it. Lenin's analysis was that the banks and banking capital, or finance capital, became the dominant sector of the capitalist class, and that all of the industrial capitalists who had in the past, say in the 19th century, been dominant, were now subservient to the banks. Why? Because the banks basically, one, had control over credit, and secondly, the banks knew the exact financial situation of each of the industrial capitalists, how strong they were, how weak they were. The banks could, because of the dire need for credit, also force weaker companies to merge with bigger companies. In other words, the banks became the engineers of the process of more and more monopoly. And you can see in the United States, 100 years ago, there were 300 car companies. Today, there are 3. That process of monopolization has gone on in the airlines and telecommunications, in the media, everywhere. And all of it behind the scenes, being manipulated, being organized, is bank capital. And bank capital also has to be exported. So you see all of the trade pacts like NAFTA or the current TPP. Those are not really about trade. They're certainly not about free trade. They're about investor rights, and that's ultimately about the rights of banks to be able to dominate the trade policies of all countries, making sure that there's no obstacle, no impediment to capital. So what Lenin said about the banks is more true today. So we would not update that except to say he identified the trajectory of the dominance of bank capital of Wall Street, for instance, and that trend has proven to be more and more the case.
I also want to come back to this question of the difference between colonial policy, or imperialism as a policy, and imperialism as a system. I want to come back to that in just a second, but well, actually, let me just start there, because then we'll do it that way. You mentioned that already, but if you could just say another word or two about this difference between policy and system and where we are today. That is, where is, other than what you've just said, maybe some other examples to help identify how is imperialism as a system working now, as opposed to when it was a policy, well, a century ago?
I think the way to look at it, the starting point to understand imperialism's evolution, metamorphosis into a system rather than a policy, is to look at what happened in Africa. In 1884, there was a conference in Berlin. It was called the Berlin Conference. There were 13 or 14 imperialist countries. The United States, which was a latecomer to imperialism, was also present. But they took the map of Africa and they divided every part of Africa up so that there could be a peaceful division between the imperialists, not like World War I, which was a military struggle between them for colonies, but a peaceful decision to divide Africa. That was 1884.
Just real quick, how many Africans were at that table?
That would be 0 Africans. And of course, they said it was for Africa's benefit, of course, that had noble causes. But they took the map of Africa and literally, Egypt will go to Britain, you know, of course, Belgium had Congo. But within 18 years from the 1884 conference in Berlin, all forms of African governance were eliminated within 18 years. And by 1902, the only independent country left in Africa was Ethiopia. So all African governance, with the exception of Ethiopia, was gone in 18 years. That's the period that Lenin says it wasn't simply a policy by this or that country, but the mad scramble for colonies led to the complete division of the world market, which then 15 years later led to a war between the imperialists about how to redivide the world market. So, and that process replicated itself again in World War II. So what Lenin said showed that imperialism in its highest, capitalism in its highest stage was imperialism inevitably driven towards war. Now the United States also recognized, weirdly, what Lenin recognized, and they tried to develop a policy in 1943, 44, 45, at the end of World War II, to avoid World War III because it was leading to the destruction of capitalism and the triumph of socialism. As we could see, socialism gained a great deal. It was a period of revolution because of the magnitude of violence and destruction of the old social order from World War II. So what the United States said, let's have the United Nations, let's end the scourge of war, again, between the imperialists, not between the imperialists and those who they were oppressing in the third world, but between the imperialists. Let's settle our differences peacefully. Let's have a World Bank, let's have an IMF. So we, the United States, who now dominate finance capital, will decide who gets the loans. We'll rebuild Europe, we'll rebuild Japan. The deal, though, is you become our junior partners. And in your junior partnership, we give you access to markets, but you allow your countries to be occupied, and you join us in the struggle against the formerly colonized people who are aligning with the socialist camp to win their own freedom. So that's how that policy shifted. So after World War II, no more colonies, but you have a new empire, not the British Empire with colonies, but American empire with 1,000 military bases dominating all of Africa, Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and intending to do so forever, but blocked by the existence of the socialist camp, which could be a countermeasure. Then there was, in our book, Imperialism in the 21st Century, talks about what happened in the 21st century, because the Soviet Union collapsed. It was overthrown. There were frailties and weaknesses, vulnerabilities within the socialist project. And once overthrown, the United States decided, and it was clear in their documents like the 1992 white paper, that the United States had engaged in a new stage of imperialism, which was a period of unipolar global US domination, which led to all sorts of adventures, like the invasion of Iraq, for instance, like the bombing of Libya, like in the 90s, the destruction of Yugoslavia, a multi-ethnic socialist republic. The United States.
We even just wrapped up the anniversary of the invasion of Panama a couple of days ago.
The invasion of Panama. When Bush knew that the Soviet Union was weakening, they identified all the weak links all around the world, especially countries that were emerging as independent countries. Panama, they could take that out. The next year, Iraq, because they knew Gorbachev wasn't ready to fight them because the Soviet Union was coming about. Those weren't necessary wars. Those were wars of choice. It didn't start with George W. Bush. It was like the next stage of imperialism. So you have colonialism, meaning the fully developed world, a global system of imperialism. The imperialists fight each other. Then after World War II, stage two, the imperialists unite with each other to fight the socialists and the national liberation movement. After conquering the Soviet Union or helping it implode, then they go on a new rampage, again, to reconquer all of the independent nationalist governments that had been sovereign under the protection of the socialist bloc. It was considered to be a mopping up operation. But of course, it turned out to be a fantasy because the people who were colonized didn't become anti-colonial because they got arms from the Soviet Union. They became anti-colonial because they wanted to be free people. They didn't want to be occupied. Iraq will never go back to colonial domination, nor will any of those countries. So the fantasy of this, the imperial hubris that went with the third stage of imperialism, actually, I believe, is becoming its undoing, which we talk about too in our book.
And this sort of, if going back to a previous question, is where Lenin was correct in mapping the trajectory of the advance of capitalism to where we now have finance capital dominating everything through banks. Is that
yes.
more or less where
yes,
you're?
and the other thing you'll see when you read Lenin's book, and our book includes the original writings of Lenin, which are very important. He ends the chapter, he said, imperialism is not only dominated by the banks in this insatiable war between imperialism to redivide the world, and others redivide the colonies. He said there's also an element of parasitism. There's another element, which is the militarization of imperialism. That militarism, in essence, starts to have its own life. And you can see that after World War II, the United States created what was now known as the military-industrial complex. There was no existing enduring military economy before World War II, but the US empire said militarism will be the road by which we not only stabilize capitalism so it doesn't endure big economic depressions like the 1930s, the government will form a kind of welfare for capitalist corporations by giving them military contracts, $1 trillion a year at this point. That's a lot of money. But it also becomes a way to dominate the rest of the world. So you have the United States. The last time the United States was invaded was 1812, the War of 1812. That's how we can remember it. It was just 204 years ago. And yet it has 1,000 military installations and bases all over the country in 150 countries. What's that for? Not defending the United States, because it's not at risk. That's to project through the exercise of militarism, imperialist domination by the banks.
Banking has come up and is looking to come up a lot more this year in the election cycle, the national presidential election cycle here in the United States. And this is something I'm personally, admittedly, struggle with, how to respond to what a lot of, I think, well-meaning people on various points on the left why they're supporting Bernie Sanders. You know, Bernie Sanders has said he wants to break up the banks. He wants to challenge their role in this country. Yet the Party for Socialism and Liberation, of which you are a representative, has its own presidential ticket, Gloria La Riva and Eugene Puryear. I'm wondering how you, as personally yourself or as an organization, are addressing this question of your analysis. Lenin's analysis correctly leads us to this critique of the banks. Bernie is here saying he wants to challenge those banks, yet you have your own presidential ticket running.
But the fundamental difference between the Party for Socialism and Liberation and Bernie Sanders on the banks is not the critique that the banks are bad. The difference is about the solution. Breaking up the banks and making the big banks smaller banks is a fantasy. It's a social democratic, liberal, democratic socialist fantasy. Because capitalism, as Lenin pointed out in our book, and his book, and the book we've updated, shows that it's a congenital feature of imperialism, of capitalism, to have monopoly domination and to have the domination of the banks. It's not an accident, it's not a bad policy, it's not because of Republicans, it's not because of Democrats, it's the nature of the capitalist system itself. So his program is in essence an attempt to reform that which is irreformable. The big banks cannot be broken up. They can be seized, though. They can be expropriated. Why should the banks, which dominate the pharmaceutical companies, that dominate healthcare, that dominate whether we have jobs or not, why should these parasites in society have access to all of the wealth, where all the income inequality that Bernie Sanders rightfully talks about is being driven based on the domination of the banks? What do the banks actually contribute? 150 years ago in capitalism, they were an entity that gave you a loan when you needed some credit. Now they dominate all parts of society. Should society be of, by, and for the bankers? Well, Bernie Sanders would say no, and we would say no too, but he doesn't say the hard thing that has to be said, which is the banks have to be seized. In order to seize the banks, you need a political revolution, a real revolution, because property forms have to change. When we look at property, does property give up its property? Does it give up its privilege without a fight? Did the slave-owning ruling class, which was the dominant part of the US capitalist class, give up its slaves? Even the slave owners who might have been more liberal, maybe didn't whip their slave as much, maybe had a more humane attitude, maybe they were good Christians, but they weren't going to get rid of this institution of slavery because that was the basis of their profit. It had to be broken up through a revolutionary process, also known as a US Civil War, which we celebrate formally. The expropriation of that class property was necessary. That's why we say we are revolutionary socialists, Bernie Sanders says, I'm a democratic socialist. Well, revolutionary socialists are democratic too, but what he's signaling is we're not really for the revolutionary seizure of the capitalist property. The reason so many people are poor in America, and 1 out of every 2 people in the United States are either in poverty or near poverty, in spite of the fact that they work hard, they take care of their kids, they want the best for themselves and their children. The reason they're poor is the banks have all the money. It's pretty much as simple as that.